Hello, my name is Dan, and this presentation is a criminological analysis on the destruction of Juukan, Gorge. My argument is simple yet unsettling. This was one of the gravest acts of cultural destruction in recent Australian history, and yet, in legal terms, no crime was committed. That gap between profound harm and legal innocence is exactly what the study of crimes of the powerful is about, and I want to use this case to show how power shapes what we call crime, who is held responsible, and how justice responds. First, what happened on the 24th of May 2020? The mining company Rio Tinto detonated explosive at two rock shelters known as Juukan 1 and Juukan 2 in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. The purpose was to expand its Brookman 4 iron mine ore. These were not ordinary caves, they were held one of the most significant records of human occupation in Australia, with evidence of continuous use stretching back about 46,000 years. Stone tools, animal remains, a preserved pollen sequence, and even preserved human hair. They were a living sacred place for the Putu Kunti Kunrama and Pinikura people, the PKKP who had cared for that country for more than 40,000 years, and in a matter of seconds, it was gone. How could this happen? The answer lies in the law. Back in 2013, Rio Tinto secured ministerial consent to disturb the site under Section 18 of Western Australia's Aboriginal Heritage Act 1972. Then, in 2014, an archaeologist confirmed just how significant the site was, including a 4,000-year-old plated hair belt that DNA later linked to living PKKP descendants. Here is the crucial detail. Even as the significance became clear, the 2013 consent could not be revisited. In 2015, PKKP won native title, but that gave them no legal power to stop the destruction. Between 2014 and 2020, they repeatedly asked Rio Tinto to consider alternatives, and 3 of the 4 mine plans were on the table would have spared the shelters. Rio chose the 4th. The ore it reached was worth about $132 million, less than 1 week of the company's revenue. So every single step here was lawful. The harm was built into the law, not committed against it. That brings us to the central question. Was a crime committed? It depends entirely on how we define crime. Under the legal definition, no, the blast was authorized and no one was charged or prosecuted. Under a social or harm-based definition, the answer is clearly yes. This caused profound, irreversible harm, and harm is the real measure of wrongdoing, not legally. Under a conflict definition, the case reveals something deeper about power. The powerful helps write the law, so the harmful conduct is defined as lawful, while the harms of the less powerful are readily criminalized. Crime, in other words, is not a fixed fact. It is a label, but the power is applied to that label is unevenly distributed. Let me apply 2 concepts directly. The first is crime of the powerful. Pierce 1976 argues that states and corporations cause enormous harm that routinely escapes the label of crime. Rio Tinto is one of the largest mining companies on earth, and the harm here did not come from a rogue employee. It came from the ordinary, profit-driven operation of a lawful business. The second concept sharpened this by Kramer and Michalowski, 2006. State corporate crime describes harm produced at the intersection of corporate goals and state action or inaction. Juukan Gorge is a textbook example of state-facilitated corporate harm. The corporation lit the fuse, but the state built the conditions. A weak heritage law and a consent process that, once granted, could not respond to new evidence. The regulator did not prevent the harm, it authorized it. The third lens is green criminology, explained by White and Heckerberg, 2014, which extends criminology beyond traditional crime to environmental and ecological harm, including harm to the cultural landscape and the country. From this view, destroying an irreplaceable 46,000-year-old site is an environmental and heritage harm of the highest order, whether or not statute was broken. Connected to this is the idea of social harm, explained by Hilliard and Toombs, 2007, which deliberately shifts our focus from crime to harm so that we can see damage the criminal law ignores. The destruction of indigenous heritage in the service of resource extraction is a continuation of colonial dispossession, privileging development over indigenous self-determination. Power here is not only economic, it is historical and rationalized. If we classify the harms, we see this was not one harm but a cascade. There was cultural and spiritual harm, the loss of sacred place, and a 46,000-year link to ancestors. There was epistemic and scientific harm, an irreplaceable archaeological and environmental record destroyed. There was psychological and social harm, deep trauma for the PKKP, who were given only hours of notice. There was intergenerational harm because future generations were denied of this heritage forever. And underlying all of this was a structural harm, a system that valued $132 million of ore over priceless heritage. So how did institutions and society responded? 3 ways. First, a parliamentary inquiry. The Joint Standing Committee on Northern Australia produced 2 reports, Never Again in 2020 and A Way Forward in 2021. It called the destruction inexcusable and recommended restitution, a moratorium, and stronger heritage laws. Second, corporate fallout. After sustained pressure from investors, the chief executive and 2 senior executives left the company in 2020, and Rio suffered serious reputational damage. But this matter, no one was charged or prosecuted. Third, legislative reform. Western Australia passed a new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act in 2021 and then repealed it in 2023 and reinstated the old 1972 law. Reform was promised and then largely undone. Now, let me interrogate those responses critically because this is where power becomes visible again. First, there was no criminal liability because the act was lawful. The justice system had no role at all. Accountability came from investors and public opinion, not the court. Second, reform stalled. The fact that Western Australia replacement law was repealed under industry pressure shows that powerful interests shape not just the harm but the response to the harm. Third, the underlying power imbalance persists. Traditional owners still do not have a legally enforceable right to say no. And fourth, the most visible responses, resignation and apologies, were largely symbolic. They address reputation, not the structural conditions that made destruction possible. The system protected itself more than it protected heritage. So, what should change? I propose 4 base reforms. 1. A legally enforceable right to free, prior and informed consent for traditional owners in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People, with no ministerial override. 2. A strong national cultural heritage framework so that weak state laws can no longer be exploited. 3. An independent heritage authority with equal Indigenous representation, Those decisions are appealable to the courts, not to a single minister. And 4. A real corporate accountability, a statutory duty of care, genuine penalties for cultural heritage harm, the restitution to affected people. The common thread is closing the gap between what the law calls a crime and what actually causes harm. To conclude, Juukan Gorge was a grave harm that the law did not call a crime. It shows how the powerful shape both what counts as crime and how justice responds. Justice failed here, not because a law was broken, but because the law was built to permit the harm. Until we close the gap between legal crime and real harm, nothing stops another Juukan Gorge.